The Society of Actuaries recently released a broad set of findings on the impact of COVID-19 on actuarial careers. The report examines the impact of COVID on our work, on our careers as actuaries, based on a survey of both members and candidates to help us understand the pandemic's impact on our actuarial work. Lisa, what are some of the work changes that you've seen that have come through as the SOA was conducting this survey?
You know, a couple of things really stood out to me. One, we've heard a lot about all kinds of people who were laid off or, their jobs were eliminated or all kinds of things. And I was glad to see that in the actuarial profession, we were fortunate. Only 8% of all the people who responded to our survey, only 8% had some kind of an employment status change. And that's everything. That includes people who voluntarily changed jobs, includes people who chose to cut back to part-time, increase their hours, as well as people who left or retired, whether voluntarily or not. So that was one thing. Overall, we were pretty lucky. And of course, everybody went from mostly working in the office to almost exclusively working remotely or working from home. And a lot of people found that challenging. That's not surprising. But nearly as many people found it actually to be a way more effective way to work.
And Lisa, I know, we all have different makeups in our households, whether we're a single household or another partner or married, children in the household, or maybe even taking care of older adults, as our part of our responsibilities. I had to imagine that, who you live with and the type of your household certainly would make a difference on the impact of the pandemic.
Oh, for sure. And again, a couple of things really, really jumped out. First, remember 8% of all survey respondents had some kind of an employment change, but 23% of women and 13% of men who live in a household that includes an adult with special care needs, 23% of women and 13% of men had some kind of an employment status change. That's compared to 8% overall. That is way bigger than any other kind of household category in terms of just employment changes. The 8%, by the way, is really about the same for men as for women. The other big thing that really jumped out was that amongst the people who made the employment changes and who live with preschool kids. So living with preschool kids and made some kind of an employment change or had some kind of an employment change. 60% of those folks cited COVID-19 related reasons for doing so. So clearly living with really small children was a especially big deal.
And let me draw on that a little further. I mean, we don't have to go very far in the news every day to see the impact of what the pandemic and dealing with care for others has had on caregivers and maybe even comparing men and women. We've probably read those types of reports. Does any of that draw over into the actuarial profession? Are we seeing a large number of women, for example, leave the workforce to take care of children during the pandemic?
Yes and no. I mean, overall, 8% of women and 8% of men had some kind of an employment change. So it's maybe not as much as a number of other professions, but of the women who did change employment status, almost half, like 43%, said that COVID-19 was a big reason behind the employment change. And that's compared to only 30% of men.
Lisa, I'm sure many of the people who are watching this have their own experiences in how their work environment or even preparing for exams is impacted, and especially through the pandemic. I can remember when I was studying for exams. The last few, my kids were young. I had some study time at work, but obviously needed to study at the kitchen table from time to time as well. And of course, my kids would see me there and tug on my shirt sleeve saying, let's go do something. And that certainly, has an impact on how effective studying might be in that environment. We also hear from my friends and associates here, some insurance companies that are local here in central Illinois, where you know actuaries who have younger kids in their household, and now those kids may have been attending school remotely. And so the work and school dynamic is just a lot different during the pandemic. And I know one of the things that the survey asked was about how pandemic working conditions, whether that was working from home all the time or perhaps with children at home who are doing remote school, how did that translate into higher levels of stress, or maybe just how it affected professional effectiveness. So in this concept of me being effective, either preparing or studying for exams, or me preparing to do my job and being effective in my job, anything that was gleaned in the survey from that angle?
It was a little, a couple of things were clear. For sure, the stresses, um, just the overall stresses of the situation, everybody was trying to live through, as well as the additional stresses of trying to manage small kids at home, or smallish kids, or kids that needed supervision anyhow, if they were remote schooling or not. The stresses and the challenges for that really came through. But at the same time, it also came through that for the most part, actuaries were really quite effective at adapting. And one of the keys, I think, to that is the flexibility that working remotely allowed. It's a little easier to work early and work
Mhm.
late. Now, I'm not saying that it was easy to have this day that never ended, but I think it was the flexibility that working remotely afforded that made it possible to adapt and continue to be professionally effective. There was one quote I remember, where someone had written in, "Let's just be clear, I might not be quite as effective in some of these things, but my performance has not changed. I'm just finding different ways to do it."
Right, right. I mean, and working at home, that's kind of the next question for a lot of actuarial jobs and careers, even companies contemplating when and how and what does that new environment look like with potential flexibility. And so let's take that as well. We've heard a lot of post-pandemic hybrid work arrangements ranging from full remote, but some investment banks also, you hear stories about saying everyone needs to be in the office. I guess, is there a preference among the actuarial profession as to what they want to do?
Clearly, clearly. Um, Two-thirds, basically, 65% of respondents, and this is, I should have said up front, this is everybody worldwide, and maybe three-quarters of the respondents were from the United States. So there's definitely skewed response toward the US. But two-thirds said they'd like to work from home at least 3 days a week. Now, for some people, that meant their preferred time was 3 days a week, but a quarter of the total group said they'd really just prefer to work from home pretty much all the time. And I found it interesting that women had a slight preference to work from home a little bit more frequently than did men. And I would also note that in the full report that comes out, when we break out results by country, it's really clear that the U.S. dominates these results. In other countries, there's maybe not quite as much a preference to work from home quite as often. So I just want to put that out there.
Yeah, sounds good, Lisa. Thanks for sharing those observations. And look for this study, the impact of COVID-19 on actuarial careers and other helpful research released from the Society of Actuaries.